All right. Thank you all for joining tonight. We are going to be talking about tax time for nonprofits, getting your annual filings in order for your organization. My name is Shana Roth-Thornley. I'm an attorney at Community Law Center. We will be spending about an hour on the slides and questions. So feel free to put your questions in the chat, or I'll pause as we go on to ask for any questions. Don't feel like you need to write everything down. We are recording and we will be sending out this workshop, the slides to the workshop afterwards. All right. So a little bit about Community Law Center. We are a legal services provider for nonprofits throughout Maryland, and we work with a variety of groups on lots of different legal issues. So taxes are one thing that we can help with, but keep in mind that we can provide assistance on lots of legal issues for nonprofits. What we're going to cover tonight. So what you need to know for nonprofit filings. We'll talk about information that you'll want to collect before you sit down to complete the taxes that you're going to want to do. We'll talk about what those tax filings are for small Maryland nonprofits. So the Maryland Form 1, which is a couple of different forms put together. The main one that you'll want to be aware of is the annual report. And the other forms that you may have to complete for your organization are business personal property return and the Form SD1. So those are all for the state. For the IRS, there's the Form 990N e-postcard, which is one version of the Form 990 that all the 501c3 organizations need to complete. So depending on the organization's finances, you may do the 990N or another version of that. But I would say most commonly with the organizations that Community Law Center works with is the 990N. That's the one that most organizations we work with have to do. And we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about charitable solicitation registration, which is another state requirement that is separate from the Form 1. So we'll talk about that. And then other important reminders and further legal assistance. The workshop tonight is just for informational purposes. You don't want to see it as legal advice because you really want legal advice to be tailored to your specific situation, your organization, and its questions. So attending the workshop doesn't make you or your organization a client of Community Law Center, but I'll talk towards the end of the workshop about how you can become a client and get that legal advice on tax filings or other legal issues. Okay, so thinking about information that you want to start to gather before you sit down to complete the forms. One thing is your current list of your board of directors and your officers. So you want to have everyone's name, their contact information, their address, phone number, email address. This is something that I think is good to have and just make sure is always updated for your own internal records, but it's also something that you may need for the tax filing. So if you've already got it to hand, then that's great. You'll want to know what your fiscal year is. So when does your fiscal year start and end? Often this information is in your organization's bylaws. So that's where I would start if you're not sure what our fiscal year is. For a lot of organizations, it's going to be the calendar year, January 1st to December 31st, but sometimes organizations set a different fiscal year. They might have a major funder who's on a different cycle, and so they follow the funder. So that's information that you want to collect. Your Maryland Department ID number. So this is a state identifying number that is issued when the organization incorporates. So this is something that you can look up on the state's website, and we'll talk about where to find that. But that one you'll want to have for the state tax filing. Similarly, the federal EIN, employer identification number, this is the number that you communicate with the IRS using this number. So this is what the IRS issues when you apply for 501c3 status. This is what you use to talk with the IRS. This is also a number that your bank probably uses to identify your organization. And we'll talk about where you can find this one. A copy of your articles of incorporation and any amendments, a copy of your bylaws. These are, I think, just useful to have on hand for things like, when is our fiscal year? You know, is there anything in our articles or bylaws that, you know, we might want to know about? And I think this is also a good time as you're doing your taxes to think about what other organizational compliance might we need to think about. Are we still following our bylaws, or do we need to update them? You know, where is our articles of incorporation, you know, for just internal record keeping purposes? Do we know where we have a copy? Your IRS determination letter. So if your organization is a 501c3, having a copy of this letter, you know, with your other important documents, knowing where it is a good idea, so that if you have a funder or a partner that asks to see a copy, you know where it is. And there might be information in here about the date that your organization was recognized as a 501c3 that you might need. Your organization's bank name and account number. You might need this for, likely not, you're likely not going to have to pay anything to file these tax forms because you're a nonprofit, but good to have this information somewhere that you can access it easily as well. And then you'll want some information about your organization's finances for the past year. So what was the total revenue that you brought in for the last fiscal year? What was the amount of contributions that you received in the last fiscal year? And how many contributions have you received so far in the current fiscal year? So this is going to be information that you'll want to collect so that you can fill out these forms without having to, you know, get started and then say, oh, we need to talk to the treasurer or the bookkeeper for this. So if you can get started with collecting this information earlier, then it'll be a smoother process to complete the filings. Okay. Oh, was that a question? All right. So the tax forms that we're going to fill out, or that we're going to talk about, the Maryland Form 1, the IRS Form 990N e-postcard, and the charitable solicitation registration. So jumping right in, the first form we'll talk about is the Maryland Form 1. So this is the annual tax filing that your organization is going to do for the state of Maryland. Every nonprofit that's incorporated in Maryland has to fill this form out every year. Even if you didn't do much that year, or you were on hiatus, maybe not a lot happened during the pandemic, you still need to fill this form out every year to keep your organization's nonprofit status, to keep its incorporated status. So this is just, you're really saying we're still active, you know, don't forfeit our organization or nonprofit. And it's the same form that for-profit businesses file. The for-profit businesses have to pay a fee to file this form. Nonprofits don't pay a fee. There's no filing fee for nonprofits. So the Form 1 is really made up of two separate forms. There's the annual report, which every organization is going to have to fill out. And then there's the business personal property return that for-profits have to fill out, nonprofits might have to fill out. The Form SD1 is another form that, depending on your organization's situation, you may have to complete. And I'll also say, in the follow-up email, along with the slides, we're going to be sending out the copies of these forms so you can see them, some information on filling them out, how-to guides, so that you can really use that as a step-by-step when you go to fill them out. This is just going to be kind of an overview. So what this form is, the Form 1 is really asking about personal property in Maryland. So personal property is everything other than real estate, other than land or buildings. So it's looking at office supplies and furniture, equipment, tools, other supplies, things that a nonprofit or a for-profit owns, leases, or uses. And so they're really wanting to keep track of this more for the for-profit businesses, but it's really the same form everybody's using. So all nonprofits are going to have to fill this out if they are incorporated in Maryland, and it's due April 15th. So when you're doing your own personal income taxes, you want to be thinking about your organization's taxes as well. So fill this out every year and submit it to the state to avoid forfeiture of the organization's nonprofit status. If you miss that April 15th deadline and don't file it, at first the state will list the organization on its website as not in good standing. So you won't immediately lose your nonprofit status, but you will be listed as not in good standing. And that is kind of the reminder, we have to fill this out so we don't lose that status. So you want to make sure you do this one every year. If you miss it, if you are forfeited, having not submitted this form, the organization is going to need to file articles of revival and pay another fee to the state to get its nonprofit status back. So you really want to make sure to do this form. Every time tax day comes around, that's a reminder. We need to do our organizational tax form as well. Okay. So you can check your organization's status, and this is also where you're going to find that Maryland department ID number for the organization. So you'll go to this website. This is the Maryland Business Express entity search, and you can search for your organization by name here, and what'll come up is general information. So, principal office, resident agent, when the organization was formed, and then some information about its filings and when they were submitted. So that's a good place to start to say, did we do the form this year, and make sure we are still incorporated in good standing. Okay, so how to file. You're gonna either fill out you can print out and complete a hard copy of the form, mail that into the state. I believe you can also drop it off, but you can also now file online through the Maryland Business Express website. So that can be a good option just for getting it done really quickly and submitting it right away. So the deadline is April 15th, but you can also request an extension. Those extension requests have to be in by April 15th as well. So it gives you another 6 months, but you do have to make the request before the April 15th deadline. And the link to do that extension request is here. Okay, so I kind of threw this in just so you can go back and access this information when you're ready to file, but you can find the forms on the state's website. You can find instructions that the state prepares that answer, a lot of the more detailed questions you might have. And then you can also find previous years' versions of the forms. So if you missed previous year's filings and the organization lost its nonprofit status, one thing that they'll require is that you go back and submit those missing years forms, and you can find those on the state's website. So copies of the forms there via those links. And then here's what the form looks like. Just the kind of basic overview, the annual report, the part of the form that's due for every nonprofit is only 2 pages. And what it's going to ask for is what type of entity is this? If it's a nonprofit in Maryland, it's a domestic non-stock corporation. So you're going to check that box. And again, these instructions will be emailed to you, so you'll have a copy. And then you're going to fill out the information about the nonprofit. So the name, mailing address, EIN, department ID number. And then it's going to ask for the names of your board members. And for the officers, the president, vice president, treasurer, secretary, it's going to ask for addresses as well. So that is something that you want to have so that you can include that information. And then on the second page, it's going to ask for some more specific information about the organization's personal property and what it did that year. So the first question on the second page is going to ask, did this organization own or lease any personal property this year? So that would be things like office supplies, computer, phone, furniture, equipment, books. So a lot of organizations will say, yes, we did own some supplies, even if it wasn't a lot. And other organizations might, say, well, we didn't actually own anything. Maybe we we borrow equipment and materials, or our members and our board use their own computers, so they might check no. Either way, you choose the answer that's correct for your organization. It'll also ask about whether your organization has a trader's license, so a business license issued by the state. So if you answered yes to either of those questions, more commonly the first one, does your organization own or lease personal property, you might have to complete the rest of this Form 1, the business personal property tax return. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Then the final section of the annual report is the signatures. So it should really be a corporate officer, president, vice president, secretary, or treasurer who completes this form. But if you're working with an accountant or an attorney, there's a place for them to sign as well. Okay, that question about does your organization own, lease personal property? If you answer yes, you may have to complete the business personal property tax return. The reason for this is that being incorporated as a nonprofit in Maryland, and also being a 501c3 recognized by the IRS, doesn't necessarily make the organization exempt from personal property taxes. The state has issued some kind of confusing guidance on this, but basically what it boils down to is religious groups, nonprofit hospitals, cemetery and mausoleum companies are automatically considered exempt from personal property tax. Other organizations, if you don't fall into one of those categories, may have to apply for an exemption from this tax. There's some other exceptions as well. If everything that the organization owns, all of its personal property, originally cost less than $2,500, it's all exempt. And if you've applied for and been granted an exemption by the state, and there's an application that you can fill out for that, then you're exempt. So if you have one of these exemptions, you can let the state know about that when you file this form. If you don't have one of those exemptions, we've seen organizations be successful in just saying, we're considered exempt from this tax. We haven't seen the state really push back on that. And until a few years ago, when they kind of changed their instructions on this form, really every nonprofit, I think, just, said we're exempt. The state never followed up on that. I don't know if they're doing more enforcement and trying to get people to do this exemption form, but I would probably recommend that if your organization doesn't fit into one of these categories, it's not a religious group, nonprofit hospital, or cemetery or mausoleum company, I would say you might want to apply for that exemption. And that's a separate step from all the applications you've done already. And I'll talk about that. Or that total original cost of all of the personal property was less than $2,500. So things here, I think, it's not as clear as it could be to give just really clear-cut guidance for nonprofits. I have been recommending that groups do that personal property exemption application. Okay, so if none of those apply to your organization, you do own or lease personal property, it originally cost more than $2,500. You don't fit into one of those categories of types of nonprofits that are automatically exempt, then you may need to complete the business personal property return. I have seen organizations be successful at saying we're exempt, writing that on the form. But if you do need to fill out this business personal property return, I think a lot of the information you might not need to give as much information as it's going to look like you do. The one exception here, I would say, if your organization leases something like a copier from another business or another nonprofit, then you do want to fill out this form and give the information about the item that you lease. Okay, so this form, it's going to ask for some information about the organization, name and department ID number, nature of the business, fiscal year. And then you can skip a lot of the sections that aren't going to be applicable to your organization, that are more for for-profit businesses, about, you know, all where the personal property is located. I think a lot of this you may be able to just skip that, provide the information about the property that you lease if that's relevant to your organization. Okay. Then finally, the last kind of component of the state Form 1 is this SD1 form. So this is a form that organizations should fill out if they sold, transferred, disposed of all of their personal property before January 1st, 2022. So, you know, if for whatever reason your organization got rid of everything it owns, gave it away, sold it, transferred it to some other organization, then you do want to fill out this form. And you can skip most of the sections, and it's a little hard to see in the document here, but number 12, exempt personal property, that's where you'll fill out at the very bottom down there. So, and again, we have some instructions on this that I'll be sending out, but I think most organizations aren't going to need to fill out this SD1 form. Okay. Let's see, I see a question in the chat. If we're not exempt, but we don't have any property, we still just file the annual report, correct? All officers and members use their own equipment, laptops, etc. Yes, that's right. So even if you own nothing as an organization, even if the organization didn't do anything that year, but if it did, same story. You still want to fill out the 2-page annual report. That's the first part of the Form 1. Every nonprofit should be doing that if it's incorporated in Maryland. The only question is really going to be, do we also need to do the business personal property return? Okay, and then I see a question, when you file a 990N, do you file a Form 1 or a COF 85 after? So, so those are the 3 different filings we're going to talk about. So, and they're all for different entities. The Form 1 is for SDAT, the Maryland State Department of Assessments and Taxation. And they're the ones who you file the incorporation paperwork with. They're the ones who kind of regulate the nonprofits. The 990N, which we're going to talk about next, is with the IRS. And then the COF 85 is with the Maryland Secretary of State. So that's the charitable solicitation registration. So they all have kind of different deadlines and requirements. And, you know, whenever I think you're dealing with government entities, they're all going to have their own paperwork and requirements that they have for nonprofits. So you're going to do each of those, or most organizations are going to do each of those, and we'll talk about them, the other forms. Okay, so some additional Form 1 information. If you need more time to file, you can request a 60-day extension. I think I said 6 months, but it's a 60-day extension. So that one is the deadline to request the extension is also April 15th. So make sure to get that request in if you do want to get the extension. You can amend your returns within 3 years. So if you realize, oh, we made a mistake on a previous year's form, you can go back and amend those forms. And then you can find the forms for prior year filings if you missed those. So likely if you missed a previous year's filing, the state has already forfeited your organization. So you're going to need to file articles of revival to get that status back. But you will need to do the prior filings as part of that process. And then you can sign up for an email list for the state to get reminders about these filings, which I think is useful because then you get the notice, okay, you know, in late winter, early spring, now we need to be thinking about tax filings, collecting this information. It's a good reminder for this annual requirement. Okay, so I mentioned applying for that exemption from personal property taxes. Charitable organizations, so nonprofits, can apply for exemption from personal property tax. And if it's granted, then it means you don't have to do this business personal property return. It takes away the ambiguity about do we need to do it or not. If you have this exemption, you still have to do the annual report every year, but it's crystal clear to the state, to your organization, we aren't going to owe anything on personal property taxes. Or for personal property taxes. So you can find this exemption application online. And if you have questions, I've had luck with calling and emailing, I think more probably these days emailing the personal property valuation unit at the state at SDAT. I think they are processing them at, it's not fast, but the sooner you get the application in, I think, the better off. And from what I've seen, it can be retroactive as well. So if they did say for whatever reason your organization owed personal property taxes this year, if you do the exemption application, I have seen it be retroactive to previous years and get a refund. Okay, but again, so religious organizations, I think, are the main ones, automatically exempt from personal property tax, and then organizations whose the total value, the original value of their personal property was less than $2,500, also automatically exempt from paying personal property taxes. Other than that, I think we're in kind of maybe a confusing area where there is not a lot of enforcement, and organizations in the past have been, able to say we're exempt. The state hasn't always, said you owe personal property tax. So I think my recommendation is if your organization owns personal property of any kind, it's a good idea to complete this application and just, have the peace of mind of getting the exemption and having that you can point to in the future. Here's that exemption form that you can find online. And it's going to ask for some information about the organization, its sources of income, if it has employees. And I guess that's just the first page. There's some more information, and it's going to ask about, or it's going to ask for copies of the organization's documents. Articles of incorporation, bylaws, 501c3 letter, if you're a 501c3. All right. Before we move on to the next tax filing, any questions about the Form 1 from the state? Okay. Question in the chat. Is the exemption from personal property taxes something that has to be done every year, or does it last for a while? From what I've seen, once you have the exemption, it's permanent unless it's revoked for some reason. So applying is a good idea. It's an investment of your time, but then you're going to save the time in the future of figuring out, do we have to fill out this business personal property return? What do we need to include there? So it is a one-time thing. And then should all nonprofits complete the Form 1? Yes. So if your organization is incorporated in Maryland or otherwise registered in Maryland, if you're incorporated in another state, but you came to Maryland and you do work here, you should complete the Form 1. At least the annual report is going to be due for every nonprofit. And if you miss it, you're at risk of losing your nonprofit status in Maryland. Okay, question. Can you say more about amending the Form 1? I know I made a mistake. Can I do the amendment online? That's a good question. I am not sure if you can do it online or not. I will see if I can find any information on that. My guess is it might depend on how you completed the form in the past. So it might depend on what they already have in the system, but I'll see if I can find any information on that. Okay, the question was, does the business have any gross sales in Maryland? Okay, that's a good question, and I should include some of that here. So there is a question in the Form 1, what was the organization's gross sales in the past year? And so it's a confusing question, I think, because gross sales when they're asking for here is really what was your revenue for the year? What did you bring in? So it's not just did you sell anything and what was the profit from those sales? It's asking about what did the organization bring in revenue-wise in the year. So that is a good question, and I'll see what I can find about amending that and include the gross sales information in this workshop. Right, yes, so that amount you do want to include in the form. So I'll follow up about that question. That's a good one, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, we'll keep it moving. So the second annual tax filing that you're going to want to complete is the IRS Form 990N e-postcard. This is one version of the IRS annual tax form. So again, who must file? All tax-exempt organizations. So if you're recognized as a 501c3, that means the IRS you've applied, the IRS has said, yes, we recognize that you are a tax-exempt organization. So we are, sending you this determination letter. We're saying you are recognized by the IRS as a tax-exempt 501c3. However, a lot of organizations don't go through that application process. They might say, we don't really need it. We don't plan to apply for grants where we need the 501c3 status. We don't really have donors that are seeking the tax deduction that comes with the 501c3 status. But they're really considered, they're not officially recognized by the IRS as a 501c3, but they're treated as tax exempt because they're small organizations. So what we've been told by the IRS is even those organizations that don't have the IRS recognition, that don't have the determination letter from the IRS, they still need to complete this IRS Form 990N. The exception here, groups that don't need to do this tax filing every year, churches and other places of worship, other religious organizations. Okay, I see one question about the Form 1. It asks about the type of business. Which type of business would nonprofit fall under? So if you're looking at the top of that Form 1, let me go back. One more. Okay, if you're looking up here at this section, the type of business is going to be domestic non-stock corporation. Okay. And a question, we don't have 501c3 status because we have a fiscal sponsor, but we are a nonprofit, so I assume that we have to file the IRS Form 990N. Is that correct? This is a situation where I would first talk to your fiscal sponsor and see, are they filing on your behalf? Because if they are managing your funds, the fiscal sponsor might be the one who does the tax filing. So I would check with them first. But if your organization is its own entity, so if you're incorporated, but you have a relationship with a fiscal sponsor, then you are a separate legal entity. If you're not incorporated, you might be considered a project or a part of your fiscal sponsor organization. So there's a lot of factors there, and I would say the place to start is talk to the fiscal sponsor. And I'm also happy to talk more about that situation because I think it depends on what's going on with the relationship between the fiscal sponsor and the project. Okay. Okay, question, I'm a church and we don't have a 501c3. We don't file the 990. The SBA wants, okay, this one, I think, let me hold off on this. And if we're gonna get into more specifics, I'm happy to talk about those towards the end. So let me go through the 501c3 and the 990 filing, and then we'll make sure we have plenty of time for questions. Okay, let's see. Okay, so again, 990 filing is for the IRS. This one, unlike the Form 1 for the state, the deadline depends on your organization's fiscal year. So the deadline to file this for the previous fiscal year is going to be the 15th day of the 5th month of your organization's fiscal year. So if you're on a calendar year, it'll be due May 15th for your organization. And that means on May 15th, you should have filed this tax form looking back at the previous fiscal year, which if you're on the calendar year, it would be January 1st to December 31st, 2021. This one, you're filing with the IRS to let them know we're still operating. Here's what's going on with us. Here's, you know, our revenue for the year. And if you miss this form, then your 501c3 status is at risk. So this one, if you miss 3 years of filing this in a row, the IRS will automatically revoke your 501c3 status. Your organization's name will get added to a revocation list. And that means that all the things you used your 501c3 status for, now you can't do that. You don't have the 501c3 status anymore once it's revoked. You can get it reinstated, but you have to go through the process of applying again and paying another fee. So, and your income now may be subject to corporate income tax. So make sure you're doing this one every year. A little more leeway than with the state. If you miss 3 years in a row, you lose the status. So if you miss 1 year, you know, it's not as big a crisis, but I would say it's important to do every year just to have that continuity. And another thing to keep in mind, if your organization loses the status, it gets revoked, then you, depending on when you realize that and go through the process of getting it reinstated, you may be able to get it reinstated back to the date that you lost it, so that you don't have a break in when you were a 501c3, but that's not automatic. So you, if that doesn't happen, then they'll say, okay, once you go through that application to get reinstated, they'll send you another determination letter and they'll say, as of this date now, you're a 501c3 again. So that's just something to keep in mind. The sooner you recognize, okay, we were revoked, we need to get back our status, the sooner you can go through that process, the better. And the best, best of all is if you can avoid that entirely by filing the IRS Form 990 every year. Okay, so I'm focusing here on the 990N, but that is the version of the form for organizations that bring in revenue, so gross receipts before you subtract expenses. So all of your revenue for the year has to add up to $50,000 or less to use this short form, the 990N. If your organization had more revenue, so between $50,000 and $200,000 in the past year, you're going to file the 990EZ, which is going to require more information. And then the largest organizations are going to file the 990. Most of the organizations that I work with are filing the 990N. They are in that $50,000 and under range. And so you can check the organization status, make sure it is still in good standing with the IRS by going to this IRS exempt organizations select check. And so that will allow you to search for the organization by name and check, have we filed the 990? Okay. And one thing to know, the 990 is, it's a lot shorter than the other versions of the form. It's 8 questions and it's online only. So you will have to set up an account through the IRS website to fill this out. And to complete the form, you'll need your organization's EIN, employer identification number, and that's also known as a taxpayer identification number. You'll need the organization's name, mailing address, website if it has one, other trading as or trade names that the organization uses, the name and address of a principal officer who's filling out the form, and you'll confirm that the organization's annual gross receipts are $50,000 or less. So this one, you can do it pretty quickly. I think often the biggest issue is remembering where you put your login information from for the account. So, so this one you want to make sure you do, again, for the IRS every year. If you have missed a previous year's filing, the IRS only allows you to do the current year through their website. So there are some outside service providers that let you file missed forms from previous years. There's no late filing fee, there's no penalty, but you want to make sure that you're doing the form really every year so that you don't risk losing the status, having that automatic revocation that happens if you miss 3 years in a row. So I would say if you've missed 1 year, maybe not such a big deal. Make sure you do it this year and then going forward. If you've missed 2 years, 3 years, then I think you do want to make sure you go back and do the years that you've missed so that you aren't at risk of revocation. Okay, how to file. If your organization is not yet recognized as a 501c3, you may have to call the IRS to establish an account to file this form. So this is for those organizations that are churches and other houses of worship, small organizations that aren't 501c3s. They should still be doing this tax form, but they'll need to call the IRS to get set up to do that. And you can request an exemption on, or an extension, I'm sorry, on this form, that it does give you a 6-month extension to file by filing the form 8868 with the IRS. That gives you an extension of the time to file. Just be aware, we've been seeing some issues. I don't know if I should call them scams or not, but groups that try to send you something that looks like an official notice from the IRS. And they say, we can help you file this form, pay us a fee, and we can help you. There's no fee to file the 990N with the IRS. So, if someone is saying you have to pay a fee to do this, they may be a private company that's saying we can help you for a fee, but you don't need to go through them. You can go directly to the IRS to file. If you have questions, you can come to Community Law Center. And so this is just something to be aware of. Be clear about, who is this coming from? This is a company in Boca Raton, 501center.com. Make sure you know who it is that is sending you this information and who you're providing information to. Okay, questions about the Form 990N for the IRS. Okay. All right, the final filing that we're going to talk about tonight is the charitable solicitation registration. So this is another annual form. This one is for the Secretary of State of Maryland, and they want everyone who is asking for donations, grants, any kind of charitable soliciting in Maryland. They want them to register every year so that the Secretary of State's office knows who is seeking donations and funding in Maryland, and so that donors can look up these groups and see, is this a legitimate group? Have they registered with the Secretary of State? So if you are an organization that's applying for grants or seeking donations in Maryland, you should make sure you're filing this every year, unless you're a religious organization. They don't have to file this form. So a church or other house of worship, or if you're only seeking donations from membership, so only, member dues, then you don't have to do this filing also. This one is due every year within 6 months of the end of your fiscal year. So if you're on a calendar year, it's going to be due June 30th for you. And let's see, I'm not sure this is, I'll have to check and see if this is still in effect. I think I'm not sure if the state of emergency has been terminated or not. But this one, the last year and 2020, there were some extensions on the tax filings and this registration, but I'll have to see if that Secretary of State of emergency is still in effect. And so this is kind of a transparency and accountability requirement that we're seeing some more enforcement from the Secretary of State. They want to see that groups are doing this registration every year. If you don't do this registration, the organization and its directors could be on the hook for liability for damages, including criminal penalties. So you really want to make sure you're doing this filing every year. You can check the organization's status on this website, the Maryland Secretary of State charity page. You can search the organization by name and see, has it filed this registration for the year. And keep in mind, this is just for Maryland. Other states where you're maybe applying for grants or seeking donations could have their own requirements. So you can check that multistatefiling.org website to see what, if you have a funder in New York or Pennsylvania or Delaware, see what their requirements are for those states. Do they have a registration requirement? And you can register by going to that Secretary of State website. There's different versions of the form depending on the organization, depending on what it brought in donations. So if the organization received more than $25,000 in the fiscal year, it's going to file, I believe the initial registration is the COR 92 form. And then every year after that, it's going to be the COF 85 that someone had mentioned. So that's for organizations that bring in $25,000 or more in donations in a fiscal year. If your organization brought in less than $25,000 in donations, then the version of the form it's going to file is the exempt organization fundraising notice. And so again, whichever version you're doing, you're going to be doing it every year. So you'll want to reassess every year, which one do we have to file? Were we over $25,000 or under $25,000? Oops. Okay. Other important reminders. So I think this is, as you're doing the tax filings, this is just a good time to take stock. Have we been keeping meeting minutes? Do we know where they are? Are we keeping them all together? Do we know where all of our corporate records and documents are? All our policies, our bylaws, our articles of incorporation, our 501c3 letter, and maybe keep hard copies and maybe a version in the cloud, like in Google Docs or something like that, so that we can access them. Are we keeping a budget and reviewing it regularly? And having our treasurer or some other person present financial updates regularly. Okay, question in the chat. Is recording Zoom meetings an acceptable legal substitute for written minutes? So I recommend against recording meetings. First, because if you're discussing something confidential, you might not necessarily want to have a record of that could be discoverable in litigation in the future. And then second, just because I think, for ease of looking back and saying, what did we discuss and decide at that last meeting? You might not necessarily want to go back and have to look through, and an hour's worth of Zoom footage to find the answer. I think it's a little easier to go back and, review what was that decision we made a few months ago if you can look through the meeting minutes. So that's kind of my pitch for keeping written minutes. And okay, I'm gonna pause on that question and then we can come back to it. We just have a few more slides here. Okay, so keeping a budget, reviewing regularly, annual audit or financial review is another good idea to make sure you know where are we with our financial situation. Regularly review the organization's resident agent information. Is this still the right person to receive mail for the organization? The bank signatories, are these still the people who should be signing financial documents and checks? Reviewing the organizational bylaws, record keeping, fundraising, business plan. Are we still following the bylaws? Are these policies still, what makes sense for our organization? If we have employees or trademarks or trade names, unrelated business income, lobbying activities, if we do things in other states, there might be other filings that the organization will need to complete. So that's where I would say, for those things, consult an attorney, consult a tax advisor or an accountant, and just say, here's our situation. Maybe things have changed since last year. What do we need to know? And then if your organization is buying anything, food for events, supplies, materials, if it's a 501c3 recognized by the IRS, you can apply for exemption from state sales and use tax through the Maryland Comptroller's Office. When you get that approval, they give you a little card that you can show to vendors and not pay sales tax on the items you buy for the organization. Okay, for donors, make sure you're providing receipts for their donations. If those donations are over $250, so that the donor can get that tax deduction. I think in general, you want to be providing receipts and thank you notes to your donors, but it's required for donations of over $250 to claim a tax deduction. For all of your fundraising materials, you want to include the Maryland Charitable Solicitations Act disclosure, which basically says they can get a copy of your organization's financial statement by contacting the organization. If the organization's selling anything, you may have to be collecting sales tax on that and filing a sales and use tax report with the comptroller. So you can find some more information and the form for that on their website. And then if your organization has unrelated business income, so income that is not related to your charitable purpose, but really just to raise revenue for the organization. So something separate from the charitable work that just brings in revenue, you may have to pay tax on that separate from everything we're talking about here is charitable income. So that's a situation where I would say if you have, like a significant source of revenue that's not related to the charitable work, that's a good time to consult an attorney, consult an accountant and say, are we doing what we need to do here? Brief legal advice. So I saw there were a couple more specific questions in the chat. On those ones, I'm going to take another look and see if I can answer them now. If not, what I'm going to recommend is that you contact Community Law Center for brief legal advice. So what we're doing is we have these free 45-minute appointments with an attorney so that you can ask questions. For some, if it's a more detailed situation, we might say submit an application for legal services so that we can, match you with an attorney. But the brief legal advice is free. You don't need to fill out an application. There's just a form where we ask for some basic contact information and what the issue is. And so I'm going to put that link in the chat. Other further legal assistance from Community Law Center. If your organization has legal questions or is looking for help from an attorney, you can apply for services using this link. And we can help with a variety of legal issues. So the tax stuff that we've talked about tonight, but also nonprofit maintenance and governance issues, real property, contracts, employment, zoning, intellectual property, nuisance issues, and more. We have workshops. We do a workshop once a month on starting and maintaining a nonprofit. We can do more tailored workshops for your organization and its board. So you can contact us about that. And here is our contact information. So I'm going to put my contact information in the chat. Let me stop the share. And okay, so my contact information is here. And for the brief advice, I'll put that link in the chat as well. So yeah, you can go to that link, fill out that form, and an attorney will contact you. And now, is the time to get in touch about tax filings. That state filing is due April 15th, so now is a good time to get that one done. And let me take a look at the questions in the chat. Okay, does donations equal gross receipts? So if we received $2,000 in donations through PayPal, but only received 1.8 due to PayPal fees, the donations are still 2,000. That is a good question. I can look into that and see if there's some more information there, how fees factor into that. So I don't want to speculate. I can look into that for you. And then, are we required to provide receipts to donors over $250, even if they don't ask for them? I would say you do still want to provide them. I think just as for your own purposes, the donor might not need them, but I would still provide them. You might not be required to, but I think it's still a good practice to issue those receipts. And let's see, I know there was an earlier question. Okay, the organization is a church and doesn't file the 990. The SBA wants us to obtain certification from the IRS that we don't have to file. And I'm sorry, the SBA, is that the Small Business Administration? Okay. You may be able to get that from the IRS. I hesitate a little bit because I know the wait times just to call in with a question have been really long for the IRS lately. So I can see if there's anything that's like really clear on their website or in the regulations that you might be able to point to. You might be able to show them your 501c3. Oh, you don't have a 501c3, right? Yeah. So I can see if there's anything that you might be able to use. You can also try reaching out to the IRS and see if they can, if they have something they can issue. But the way things have been, lately with trying to contact customer service over there, it's been a lot of long waits. So I'll see what I can find about that and include that on the materials.
All right, thank you.
Sure, yeah. So we're right at 7. Are there any other questions? And feel free to reach out via the brief legal advice, and I'll also include the link for applying for legal services for the more detailed legal assistance.
Do I have to type my question in the chat?
No, go ahead. Feel free to go ahead and ask.
Okay, so we're a church. We don't have a 501c3, but we do have a nonprofit faith-based organization. It's called Virtue Training Institute and Empowerment Center. So I want to put the church under the umbrella of Virtue only. Well, kind of because Virtue has the 501c3, even though the church has been organized since 1988 and we have not had a problem. But some of the things we're running up against now want the 501c3. And I've talked to IRS for 2.5 hours yesterday, and they're still, the guy on the phone was pressing real hard about getting the 501c3, the letter of determination. And I did send some information to SBA stating that churches are exempt, but they still want something from the Internal Revenue saying that they certified us that we don't have to do that 990.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation because the rule is clear. You don't have to have a 501c3 status to be considered exempt as a church, but some funders and I guess also government agencies still want to see the letter, even if you can say, legally we don't have to have the status to be considered exempt. So I know that there are some churches that have still gone through that process of applying and getting the 501c3 status just to be able to have the form to show. That doesn't help in your situation right now. So I think considering a fiscal sponsorship from a 501c3 could be a good idea. That's a situation I would definitely recommend requesting that brief legal advice appointment, just to think about, what do we want to have in place with this organization that might sponsor us? What other options are there, and what do we need to think about?
Well, the organization uses the same address as the church.
Okay.
It's separate from the church, but one of the president of the organization is a member of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the bylaws and articles of incorporation are very similar to the mission of the church, but they are not considered a church.
Yeah. I think with those situations where you have the two entities and you might have one fiscally sponsoring the other, some of the things you do want to think about are, do we have enough, non-overlapping people in decision-making roles for both organizations? Are we keeping the finances clear and separate for the two organizations? Do we have a written agreement between the two organizations for how this will work? Those are all things you want to think about before you have that, really put that into effect.
And if we do that, is there a form that has to be completed with the Internal Revenue Service?
So it would really depend, what it is that you need and what you're trying to do. But I would say put in that brief legal advice request, and we can give you some guidance there. And then if you did want to work with an attorney to draft the fiscal sponsorship agreement or think through some of the other, conflict of interest issues, corporate governance, that's something that we could help with. But yeah, unfortunately, it's the exemption for the religious organizations, I think, is intended to take away that barrier, make things a little easier, but in some situations it just makes things more complicated, which I think is what you're experiencing. So, but yeah, that's a good situation to talk with an attorney, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute. Great. All right. Well, we are a few minutes over time, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and say thank you all so much for attending tonight.